Today, we are diving into a case that starts with an unbelievable family tragedy and spirals into this complex legal puzzle that stretches all the way from New York to the Philippines. This isn't just about old laws and procedures. It's a very human story about family, loss, and what happens when legal systems from two different countries have to figure out how to work together. Let's get into it.
So let's set the stage. Our story begins with the Cunanan family. They had, by all accounts, built an amazing life for themselves, only to see it all come to an end in the most horrific way imaginable.
You have Dr. Jose Cunanan and his wife Dr. Evelyn Perez Cunanan. They were both successful doctors living in Syracuse, New York, with their 3 kids. But then, on a cold January night back in 1982, a fire just completely destroyed their home. And tragically, no one made it out. The entire family was gone. This one terrible event is what kicked off a legal fight that would go on for years and years. Now, to really understand the legal battle here, we've got to rewind a few years. Back in 1979, both Dr. Jose and Dr. Evelyn drew up separate wills, just 4 days apart from each other. So after the fire in '82, these wills were brought before a New York court and, everything went smoothly. They were admitted to probate. But that's not where the story ends, not by a long shot, because the Cunanans still own property back in the Philippines. Okay, so let's get into the documents that are at the very center of this whole thing. The 2 wills, well, they were almost identical, and that created a really specific and, frankly, unusual legal headache. And here is where it gets really tricky. Both wills had this one identical and absolutely critical clause. It basically said that if they died at the same time and you couldn't tell who died first, the law should just presume that Dr. Jose died before his wife. Now, that might sound like a tiny insignificant detail, right? But the consequences were huge. It meant that, for just a legal instant, all of Dr. Jose's property and assets would pass to his wife, Evelyn. Then, her entire estate, which now included his, would go to her family. This one little clause effectively cut Dr. Jose's side of the family out of the inheritance completely. So you might be asking, how does a will from New York get enforced in the Philippines anyway? Well, it's through a process called reprobate. It's kind of like having a will validated for a second time. Because the Cunanans owned land in Bulacan, their wills, which were already proven to be valid in New York, had to be proven valid all over again in a Philippine court before that property could be dealt with. Okay, so the stage is set, the stakes are clear, and the legal battle lines are drawn. On one side, you have the mother of Dr. Evelyn Perez, and on the other, the brothers and sisters of Dr. Jose Cunanan. The legal ball got rolling in the Philippines when Dr. Evelyn's mother, Salud Perez, filed the case. The court quickly put her in charge of the estate. But there was a huge problem. None of Dr. Jose's brothers and sisters were ever notified about any of this. When the Cunanan heirs finally found out what was going on, they were furious. They argued that they had been deliberately shut out of the process, which is a pretty serious violation of their right to due process. And this right here is the heart of the legal fight. The argument from Salud Perez's side was, pretty straightforward. Since the wills technically give everything to her side of the family, Dr. Jose's siblings aren't technically heirs. And if they're not heirs, they don't need to be notified. Simple. But the Cunanan heirs fired back, saying, no way. They argued that the rules for probating a foreign will still require that all potential heirs have to be notified just like you would for a local will. They were his family and they absolutely had a right to be heard.
You would think this would be a fairly straightforward procedural question, right? Well, it turned into an absolute mess in the lower court, with a whole series of confusing and frankly contradictory rulings. At first, the regional trial court did something that probably surprised everyone. It just threw the whole case out. It refused to reprobate the wills at all, and the reason was basically a legal technicality.
Okay, so the court's reasoning was based on this really critical legal idea. In a Philippine court, you can't just assume what the law is in another country. You actually have to prove it as a fact. Since Perez hadn't officially presented evidence of New York's specific laws about wills, the court had to fall back on a default position, which is to assume that New York law is the same as Philippine law. And under that assumption, the wills were invalid. They didn't meet the local rules, like having 3 witnesses instead of 2. So after years of this legal back and forth, the case gets a new judge, and this judge comes up with a totally new reason to deny the petition. He ruled that you just cannot probate 2 separate wills, even if they're for a husband and wife in the same court case. And it was this final decision that sent the entire mess all the way up to the Supreme Court. So understandably frustrated by all this procedural chaos in the lower court, Salud Perez takes her case to the highest court in the land. And thankfully, the Supreme Court stepped in to untangle this whole mess with a couple of very clear, very decisive rulings. The Supreme Court's decision basically boiled everything down and clarified two major issues that had kept this case stuck in limbo for years.
The Supreme Court really just cut right through all the confusion. First, on the issue of probating the wills together, the court was just practical. It said, look, making one single document that's a joint will is forbidden, but hearing two separate wills in one proceeding to save time and money, that's perfectly fine. Let's be efficient. Second, on the issue of notice, the court did not mince words. It ruled that Dr. Jose's siblings are known heirs, and they absolutely have a right to be notified. It's a fundamental part of due process, period. The court also gave everyone a handy checklist of the 5 things you have to prove to get a foreign will reprobated. Perez had already proven points 2, 3, and 4, that the Cunanans lived in New York, the wills were probated there, and it was the right kind of court. But she had dropped the ball on the 1st and 5th points. Crucially, she hadn't submitted actual proof of what New York's laws on wills really said.
So what was the final outcome? Well, it wasn't a clear win or loss for either side on the inheritance itself. Instead, you can think of it like the Supreme Court hitting a giant reset button. It threw out the lower court's bad ruling and sent the case back down with very clear instructions. Give Perez a chance to properly prove the New York law, and this time, make absolutely sure the Cunanan heirs are properly notified. Now, beyond the tragedy of this one family, the Vida de Perez case is still so important because it reinforced several key legal ideas that really shape how our courts work, especially when international issues are involved. So what are the big takeaways from all this? There are really 4 main points. First, you can't just walk into a Philippine court and mention a foreign law. You have to prove what it says like any other fact. Second, due process is king. You have to notify all the known heirs. Third, the rules are supposed to help achieve justice, not get in its way. And fourth, our courts care about being practical and efficient, which is why they'll allow things like joint probate of separate wills.
And this powerful quote from the decision really says it all. The whole point of all these legal rules and procedures isn't to create frustrating roadblocks. It's to find the clearest, fastest, and fairest way to get to a just result. The rules are a tool for justice, not a weapon to delay it.
Ultimately, this whole case became a masterclass in why procedure matters so much. It's a reminder that fairness isn't just about who wins in the end, but about making sure everyone gets a fair shot to be heard along the way. And it really leaves you with something to think about. How does that commitment to getting the process right, something as simple as notifying all the right people, protect the very idea of justice for everyone?